Well, blessed good morning to all of you, and I just want to thank Hayden. What a great visualization of the cross to really put our minds into what Jesus was willing to sacrifice and to go through for us. As he was speaking, I was thinking about his scourging and how, as he talked about lifting himself up for a breath of air, and how his back being just open, laid open with all sorts of wounds and scars, and how that would rub against that rough wood. It's just, it's quite the visual. So thank you, Hayden, for that great lesson. As was announced, we have a lot of things, a lot of activities coming up for us to be together, to grow together. Our singing tonight. Let's remember we have our summer series coming up in just a few weeks. We have our VBS. Let all those friends and family know who have young kids that they're invited. We want them to be part of that. And our VBS is every Wednesday night through the summer, June, July, and August. So we hope that you can be involved. We hope you'll invite others to be involved in great opportunities. This morning I want to do a sequel lesson. Remember, a few weeks ago, I did a lesson that I called The Rest of the Story. And we looked at the story of David and Goliath, and we talked about how that was just, it's a great story, but it's a small part of a bigger story. A bigger story, a bigger comparison that the author is making. And what makes the story of David and Goliath so crucial is that this big comparison really comes about in the story of David and Goliath. You really start to see how different David is from Saul. And so we talked about it's really a story about God's king versus man's king. Well, what I want to do this morning is I want to continue looking at that story and give you some more of the rest of the story. Because there is a character that enters into this story that is so impressive. And yet we don't talk a lot about him. He very seldom, very rarely gets talked about when we're talking about David and Saul and David and Goliath. But he is so a great positive lesson for us. I like to call this character, I call him the Nathaniel of the Old Testament. The Nathaniel of the Old Testament. And what I mean by that, you remember in John, the Gospel of John, as Jesus comes and he sees Nathaniel, and remember what he says about Nathaniel? Here is an Israelite in whom there's no guile. I mean, to have our Lord and Savior to say that about your character is really meaning something. And I think long before Nathaniel, the same could be expressed of this character we're going to talk about this morning. We're going to do a character study. And I'm going to emphasize that word character, a character study, because that's going to be the central theme of our lesson. And so, as we continue on in the story is about David and Saul. That has not ended. We're still looking at God's king versus man's king. We're seeing the destruction of Saul as he is addicted to trying to keep the kingdom and the throne for himself and for his son, and how that just makes him fight against God, and how he unravels and all the damage he does in his wake. But it's not just a lesson about David and Saul. It's not just about that story. It also is about this character that we want to talk about, Saul's own son, Jonathan. Jonathan just gives us this great lesson about what kind of character he was. So I want to begin, the first time Jonathan enters into the story, it's before David. It's before David arrives on the scene, and here we have, let's go over to 1 Samuel chapter 14. Here we have Saul in his early years going out to battle, and he's winning victories. He's doing the very thing that the people wanted him to do, just like the king, like the nations round about them. Now, in chapter 13, prior to this, Saul has his first, what I call, downfall event, where Saul, forces himself to offer the sacrifices, to inquire of God before we go to battle. And as soon as he puts those sacrifices on the altar, around the corner comes Samuel saying, "What are you doing?" And of course, Saul tries to justify his actions. Now, God doesn't take the kingdom away from him at this point, but you start to see the slow downfall of Saul that will keep him from obtaining or keeping the throne. And so he's out to battle in this, what's called the Battle of Michmash. And Jonathan is there, and Jonathan is not just a soldier, he is one of the leaders of this army. He is the right-hand man of Saul. And so what does that tell us? Well, I think this is interesting. That tells us that Jonathan, number one, was older than David. Remember, as David comes on the scene, he's not even old enough to be in the army. He's just a shepherd boy keeping the flocks back home. Number two, we know that Jonathan is not just the prince, but he is the heir to the throne. And so he is in a very visible position. Just think about the two princes of the throne of England and how much visibility they get. They're on the news constantly. Everyone is following their actions. Well, Saul, his son Jonathan, is that heir to the throne that he's hoping one day he will pass on to Jonathan. And so, as they're out in battle, Jonathan and his armor bearer, just the two of them, seem to wander off, and they're out on their own self, away from the rest of the army. And look at chapter 14, 1 Samuel 14, verse 6. Then Jonathan said to the young man who was carrying his armor, "Come, let us cross over to the garrison of these uncircumcised. Perhaps the Lord will work for us, for the Lord is not restrained to save by the many or by the few." His armor bearer said to him, "Do all that is in your heart. Turn yourself, and here I am with you according to your desire." Some of my favorite words of the Bible are here spoken by Jonathan. I want you to notice as he contemplates this, he goes, "Hey, there's two of us, a bunch of these Philistines. Let's go up there and let's take them on." And it's not that he's relying on his own great ability, but he says, it's the Lord. And I know the Lord is not restrained to save by many or by few. Now, this is a lesson that comes out of the very beginning of the Bible, especially as you talk about the Exodus and you talk about the period of the Judges, where God limits the size of the army, makes it very small so that they would understand it doesn't matter what size the army is. It doesn't matter. If God is on your side, who can be against you? Let's take a look at, as they go, the armor bearer also being of great character says, "I'm with you, let's go." So verse 12, so the men of the garrison of the Philistines, they held Jonathan and his armor bearer and said, "Come up to us and we will tell you something." And Jonathan said to his armor bearer, "Come up after me, for the Lord has given them into the hands of Israel." Notice, let's go do this. Why? Because we're great. No, because God has given them into our hands. So verse 14, the first slaughter which Jonathan and his armor bearer made was about 20 men within about a half furrow and an acre of land. And there was trembling in the camp and in the field among all the people. Even the garrison of the Philistines and the raiders trembled, and the earth quaked, so that it became a great trembling. I want you to notice, when you look at Jonathan, who is he like at this point? He's very much like we're going to see in David and when he enters the scene. Very much like David when it comes to Goliath, and I don't need armor, I'll go out there, God will give me the victory, it's all about God. You see Jonathan, very impressive, being very faithful, very confident in God, that we could go and do this, just the two of us, and what do they go and slaughter 20 soldiers of the enemy. He looks very much like David at this point. Well, as the story continues on, in chapter 15, we have the second event that is the big downfall of Saul. Where Saul is told by God to go and utterly destroy the Amalekites. And Saul goes and he doesn't obey God. He keeps the king alive, he keeps some of the sheep and the flocks and the herds. And again, as this happens, Samuel shows up and says, "What are you doing?" Again, Saul tries to defend his actions, saying that he is faithful. And then he says, "We just kept them alive. What? For a good reason. We're going to sacrifice them to God." And Samuel says, "That's not what God wants. God told you what he wants. And all you have to do is do it." And then, showing the flawed character of Saul, we see him throwing the people under the bus. What was the people? The people wanted to do this. But just like the Garden of Eden, where God did not accept the excuses of Adam and Eve, he doesn't accept the excuses of Saul. And so the kingdom is given to another. In chapter 16 is that great story where Samuel goes to the house of Jesse and he's told to look not as man looks, but look at the way God looks. God looks at the heart. And David is finally anointed. He doesn't take the throne, but David is anointed. And then chapter 17 is the story that we talked about last time, where there is Goliath and he comes out. And he's the champion of the Philistines. And he yells out and he says, "Bring out Israel, your champion." And as we talked about, that champion should have been Saul. But where is Saul? He's hiding. Now, as I studied Jonathan and the tremendous man and character he was, this is the only place where I could find anything negative to say about him. Now, Jonathan is not mentioned in this chapter. He's not mentioned at all in the story of David and Goliath. But I want you to think about it. If Saul's not going out there, wouldn't you think Jonathan would be willing to go out there? I mean, we just saw Jonathan say, "Let's go. It's just me and you. We'll take on these Philistines. They outnumber us, but the Lord, he will give us victory." He's not restricted to say by many or by few. It doesn't matter. But where is he? He's not going out like before. And so Jonathan, at this point, seems to be imitating more of his father Saul than David. And I think as you look at this, that there is something that happens in chapter 18 where it really brings all of this out. This is the aftermath of Goliath. And let's look at chapter 18 and in verse 1. "Now it came about when he had finished speaking to Saul," that's David speaking to Saul, Look at this. That the soul of Jonathan was knit to the soul of David, and Jonathan loved him as himself. And Saul took him that day and did not let him return to his father's house. Then Jonathan made a covenant with David because he loved him as himself. And Jonathan stripped himself of the robe that was on him and gave it to David with his armor, including his sword and his bow and his belt. Let's talk a little bit about Jonathan after Goliath. You see, you have these words. Now, it came about when he had finished speaking to Saul that the soul of Jonathan was knit to the soul of David, and Jonathan loved him as himself. That phrase, Jonathan loved him as himself, is repeated a few times here. And it brings us right back to what? The golden rule. To love your neighbor as you love yourself. To do unto others as you would do unto yourself. And I can't help but think that Jonathan is enamored and pulled in and has this connection with David because he saw David go out there without any armor, with just a slingshot, and with God, and bring down Goliath. I can't help but think maybe Jonathan thought, that should have been me. But I wasn't strong enough. Because right after the story of David killing Goliath, you read of this friendship that develops. And look at how the author puts this. So poetic, so beautifully, that Jonathan's soul was knit to the soul of David because he loved him as he loved himself. Now, I want to take a little bit of a side note here, because there is something done with this verse that is absolutely shameful. Those trying to find some evidence in the Bible that God accepts the homosexual act, the homosexual relationship, will use this passage and try to bring out some type of homosexual connection or relationship between David and Jonathan. That's appalling. That is so shameful. None of that fits within this, but it shows you how desperate they are to find some type of positive fiber, excuse me, to make their case. That is not what the author's meaning here at all. And to take something so beautiful and so innocent and so godly to try to support something that God says is an abomination. Again, I'm going to use that word, shameful. But what a relationship Jonathan had with David and vice versa. Now, this gets to what I really want to talk about, and as we're going to develop through the rest of this, is that when you really look at it, Jonathan becomes in a very difficult situation. He's in a difficult position because what's going to happen, as you know, Saul is going to just become so jealous and so suspicious of David that he wants nothing more than David's got to die. And he becomes this vengeful, seeking out David to try to kill him so that he can keep the throne and he can continue the kingdom and one day hand it over to Jonathan. Jonathan gets placed right in the middle of those two. And again, remember, he is the heir to the throne. He is the prince of princes. He is, very visible to the world. And he wants to be faithful to his father. It's his father. He's the king. He wants to support him and be faithful to him. But in the same regard, he wants to be faithful to David, his friend that he's just made a covenant with. That's not easy. But as you continue in this story, the actions of Jonathan show what a great man and a great character he was. And we're going to dissect that a little bit. But what about in our time, in our day, in our age? Well, it seems like, and I'm going to use an illustration from the sports world. It seems like every year there is some type of scandal, some type of shocking news that comes out centered around coaches. I've highlighted a few of the college football ranks here. Married men with children who are in a very difficult position, highly visible, a lot of responsibility, a position that demands a person of outstanding character. But unfortunately, men that make bad choices over and over. And then, of course, we have probably the most recent about the New England Patriots head coach Mike Vrabel and former sports reporter Diana Rusi. And whatever you think was going on there, you have to admit this is not a person that made good choices and really question both of their characters, as both were married with children. Now, those are the negative ones. Those are the ones that we can look at and say, I don't want to be like that. I'm not going to be like that. I want to be like Jonathan. But I can take the number of those negative ones and multiply them over and over, where you have men and women coaches that are of extraordinary character and are a credit to themselves, their family, the university, the team that they serve. But Jonathan was in a difficult position, just like these men were. But his character was flawless. And we're going to find out why that is. And the reason we want to do that is because we want to turn it upon ourselves. Because we live in a society that says character doesn't matter. Doesn't matter what you do off the field. Doesn't matter what you do. Character doesn't matter. You are who you are. And to a degree, people should accept you for who you are. But if you have, like Saul, character flaws, you need to be honest to admit those and work on them, as we all do. Because we are the lights of Jesus Christ in this world. And I like to think about character this way. Character is what people see day after day after day after day as you put and let your heart, what's in your heart, come out in action. It's not a one-time event, but it's what they see in your life, in your character, day after day after day after day. The more you get to know someone, the more you understand them. The more you get to know someone, the more you get to know their character. And so we want to make sure that our character models Jonathan, a man in whom there is no guile, the Nathaniel of the Old Testament. So we are doing a true character study this morning. All right, as we continue our story in chapter 18, what happens is David is brought into the house of Saul. He has this relationship with Jonathan, this good, strong, covenant relationship. David goes out now to fight in the army, to be a leader. And of course, we know what makes Saul very upset. And we start to see again the character flaws of Saul. Verse 8, chapter 18, verse 8. Then Saul became very angry, for this saying displeased him. And he said, They have ascribed to David 10,000s, but to me they have ascribed thousands. Now what more can he have but the kingdom? So Saul looked at David with suspicion from that day on. And from that day on, he has nothing but suspicion and vengeance upon David. And he starts to pursue David, starts to pursue the death of David. Well, let's go over to chapter 19, where Jonathan, now in a very difficult situation, steps in and he saves David from his father Saul. But notice how Jonathan goes about to do this. In verse 1, chapter 19, now Saul told Jonathan his son and all of his servants to put David to death. But Jonathan, Saul's son, was greatly delighted in David. So Jonathan told David, saying, Saul, my father, is seeking to put you to death. Now therefore, please be on guard in the morning, and stay in a secret place and hide yourself. And I will go out, and I will stand beside my father in the field where you are, and I will speak with my father about you. If I find out anything, then I will tell you. Then Jonathan spoke well of David to Saul his father, and he said to him, do not let the king sin against his servant David, since he has not sinned against you, and since his deeds have been very beneficial to you. For he took his life in his hand, and he struck the Philistine. And the Lord brought about a great deliverance for all of Israel, and you, Saul, you, father, saw it, and you rejoiced. Why then will you sin against innocent blood by putting David to death without a cause? And Saul listened to the voice of Jonathan. Saul vowed, as the Lord lives, he shall not be put to death. Then Jonathan called David, and Jonathan told him all these words. And Jonathan brought David to Saul, and he was in his presence as formerly. I want you to notice how impressive Jonathan is. He goes and tells David, listen, this is what my father's planning. I'm going to find out for sure, but go hide yourself. And if I find out, I'm going to protect you. I'm going to let you know. I think one of the key things about Jonathan is that Jonathan loved the truth. He wanted to be governed by the truth. He wanted his actions to be rooted in the truth. He didn't have that character flaw that says, oh, this is my family, they can't do anything wrong. No. When he saw the evil in his father, he admitted it. And then he came to his father, and what? He used logic and care and concern. He says, why are you against David when David hasn't done anything against you? He hasn't sinned against you. And in fact, everything that David has done has been good for you. It's been a benefit for you. Why would you sin against David without cause? That'd be a difficult conversation for a son to have with a father. But in this case, it works. And David is brought back. But again, the character flaw of Saul is seen in verse 6. As Saul vows, as the Lord lives, he shall not be put to death. And we say, well, that came true because, Saul was not able because of God and because of Jonathan and because of Saul's daughter Michal, the wife of David, who next will save his life. It's kind of interesting that two of David's biggest allies were a son and a daughter, Saul, the man who's trying to kill him. But what Saul really was vowing is, I won't try to kill him. I won't put him to death. But it doesn't take very long for that to happen again, and David has to flee, run for his life, and Jonathan has to save David again. Let's go to chapter 20 now. In verse 1, David fled to Naioth in Ramah. And he came and he said to Jonathan, what have I done? What is my iniquity? What is my sin before your father that he is seeking my life? He said to him, far be it. You shall not die. Behold, my Father does nothing, either great or small, without disclosing it to me. So why should my Father hide this thing from me if it is not so? And yet David vowed again, saying, Your father knows well that I have found favor in your sight. And he has said, Do not let Jonathan know this, or he will be grieved. But truly, as the Lord lives and as your soul lives, there is hardly a step between me and death. Then Jonathan said to David, Whatever I say, I will do for you. And so as you look at this, here he comes and he saves him a second time. And remember, this is where he makes this plan, right? David, you go out, hide yourself in the field. And once I find out about my father, I'm going to shoot 3 arrows. And I'm going to tell the lad that's going to retrieve those arrows are near you. They're right by you. That means safety. But if you hear me tell the lad they're beyond you, if I shoot them beyond that lad, then that means you need to flee. And that's exactly the message that comes about. What a difficult position, and yet Jonathan is being faithful to truth. Faithful to his covenant with David, because why? His father is in error. And then let's go to chapter 23, where Jonathan comes to David again, where he's hiding, the place where he's hiding. And in verse 16, notice these words. And Jonathan, Saul's son, arose, and he went to David at Horesh, and he encouraged him. He strengthened him in God. And thus he said to him, Do not be afraid, because the hand of Saul my father will not find you. And you will be king over Israel, and I will be next to you. And Saul my father knows that also. So the two of them made a covenant before the Lord. And David stayed at Horesh while Jonathan went to his house. We didn't read this, but prior to this, Saul takes a spear and throws it at Jonathan. He's very upset at Jonathan that he's helping David. And he says to Jonathan, What are you doing? Do you not realize that as long as David is alive, you won't be the king? You won't have the throne? It will go to him? But look at the way Jonathan looked at it. I think a lot of us would understand if Jonathan, not that we would justify it, but it would be, something we would expect. The heir to the throne wants to keep that throne and to have ill feelings for David and try to help us. But that's not the way. That's not the character Jonathan was. He says, You're not going to die. The Lord has given you the throne. It's your throne. You will be king one day, and I will be next to you. I'll be there with you. Jonathan reminds me of another character in the New Testament, and that's John the Baptizer. We got Jonathan and John. John and John. But remember, John the Baptizer, I think about when Jesus came to be baptized by him, and he said, I need to be baptized by you. Even though John the Baptizer was older, even though John the Baptizer had been preaching and baptizing people, exactly what God told him, but he saw something in Jesus and said, I need to be baptized by you. He was able to humble himself. And then I think about when he's talking about his relationship with Jesus, and Jesus starts his ministry, and he's baptizing more people than John, and his disciples are upset, and he says, I am not the bridegroom, but I am the friend to the bridegroom. He must increase. I must decrease. Here was a man in whom there is no guile. If God wanted David to have the throne, he was going to let him have the throne. But I'll be right there with you, David. And the sad reality is that what Jonathan says to David, only half of it comes true. David does become king, does take the throne. But Jonathan is not there with him. And Jonathan's not there with him because the story of his death, as it's told in chapter 31, verse 2, he's faithful to his father. And once again, his father goes out to battle, and Jonathan is with him. And in chapter 31, verse 2, we read these words: "The Philistines overtook Saul and his sons. And the Philistines killed Jonathan and Abinadab and Malchishua, the sons of Saul." And if you go on to read about the death of Saul, there's even questionable way that he dies, revealing again a flawed character. But Jonathan, being in the middle of those two, showed himself to be a man of extraordinary character, loving God, loving truth, and acting based upon the reality of that truth. Faithful to David, faithful to that covenant, and faithful to his father as well. Being a true son, telling his father the truth when he needed to hear it. We look at Jonathan and we see that character matters. And I really think that one of the reasons that the author brings up Jonathan in the story as much as he does, not only because he is connected with David, but I really believe what we're supposed to take from this is that Jonathan was the man that Saul should have been. Jonathan was the man that Saul should have been. If Saul was really a godly man, was really the king that God wanted him to be, he would have looked like Jonathan. Faithful to God, faithful to the throne, accepting whatever God's plan was. But of course, we know that's not the kind of man Saul was. But despite all that, his son was. I want to leave you with this one passage in Micah chapter 6 and in verse 8. Where God through Micah says these words: "He has told you, O man, what is good. What does the Lord require of you but to do justice, to love kindness, to walk humbly with your God?" I think Jonathan did that so well, being in the middle of these two men. The question for you and me is, what about us? What about our character? Is that what people are seeing day after day? If not, let's fix that. Let's come to Jesus and be more like him. And if we can help you become stronger in character, stronger in your commitment to Jesus, or to become a child of God this very morning, why don't you let that be known as together we stand and as we sing.